Welcome to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Chris Martin.
And I'm Andrew McIntosh.
And today we're going to do something a little bit different than what we normally do on the podcast.
Yeah, so we decided that it was about time to wrap up our year and a half plus and do a bit of a review. I guess a year and a half in review. And to do that, we decided to involve some students here at the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University.
Yeah, so we asked 8 students from PRI to listen to the podcast and find a segment of one that they really liked and bring it to us. And those segments we will feature today on the show.
So rather than being totally self-gratifying and telling you all what we thought were the best moments of the podcast, we decided to outsource that a little bit. But it also gives the listeners a chance to see what some of the students here at PRI are doing in the way that they can introduce themselves, along with the clips that they thought were quite interesting.
Right. So we divided their clips into 2 shows, and today's will be the first show with a focus on conservation and local development.
Yeah, and so we're going to start off the show by kind of presenting you our own personal favorites when it came to conservation-related issues and development sustainability. And that was our very fortunate interview with Dr. Jane Goodall, who was visiting the Primate Research Institute late last year.
That's right.
And so we're going to just play a clip here for Jane, then we'll get into the student selections, and then at the end we'll come back with kind of a nice overview back from the Jane podcast as well.
Right, and now I think we should just point out that one of the reasons we really like this clip from Jane is that she has some advice for students on how to get involved in conservation.
Yeah, exactly, including her own kind of cathartic moment when she realized how important that actually was, both for science, but as well as just for the world in general. Mm-hmm. So here we go with Jane. And at what point did it become apparent to you that in addition to the scientific study and understanding the species, that there was also a great need for conservation and spreading that information around to a global audience?
It was a kind of boom moment. It was a conference in Chicago way back when. Actually, I'm sure that's the first time I met Dr. Matsusawa, because he came over with his brand new information about eye. And we had a session at this Understanding Chimpanzees conference on conservation. And it was completely shocking. It was utterly shocking, like all the way on every study site across Africa, forests disappearing, chimps caught in snares, and the beginning of the bushmeat trade, the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. And we also had a session of secretly filmed video from medical research labs, from training of circus chimps. And by this time I had my PhD, I had the life I dreamed of as a child. I was out in the field, I was analyzing data, writing some stuff, building up a research center. It was totally the ideal life. And I just came out as an activist. I don't remember making any conscious decision. It was just, okay, I've had the chimps that give me all this, now I've got to try and do something for them. And then I began traveling in Africa to the range countries, talking to NGOs on the ground, researchers, tried to get up to some, like the Minister of the Environment, or usually it was a First Lady. You could seldom get to the President. And it was during that I realized, more and more about the problems faced by the Africans, and the poverty and the disease and the lack of education. And it became pretty obvious to me that if we can't improve the lives of the people living around the wilderness areas, that conservation will never really work. And so we started our Takari program.
So what do you see the role of the young primatologist, for example?
Well, I suppose the young primatologist who's really interested in a scientific career, they better go for that first, but they're going to be pushed up against conservation all the time. Mm-hmm. Because almost everywhere you go now there are threats to the chimpanzees or other primates, so it's hard to avoid. But first things first, get your degree, get a name, get a recognition, and then maybe it'll be a bit easier to do something for conservation.
Okay, so now we're going to get into our student selections.
Yeah, and so the way this is going to work is that we sat down with the students that we had and got them to talk about, first, their research interests, secondly, how they got into primatology and why they ended up here at the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University, and then finally about their selection. So we asked things like why they chose that selection, what it means to them, and why they think it's important.
Our first student is Lucy Rigai. She's a first-year doctoral candidate in the section on social systems evolution.
My research interests are sexual behaviors and how females can advertise their fertile phase and ovulation. So we know that there is different type of cues and signals, like behavioral signals, olfactory cues, auditory signal, like copulation calls, and visual signal, like color and sexual sweating. But still, we don't know how it works together, if they are linked, if there is some chronological things. We don't know yet. So I'm just very interested about that. And I study that in olive baboons, and now I'm going to do that in Japanese macaques. So I never wanted to be a primatologist. It's not something I wanted. It just, I made choice, and now I'm here, and I kind of enjoy this. I really love monkeys and watching them, and I don't think I can do something different. So I'm just here enjoying. So I chose the interview with Dr. Nishihara because usually when we talk about fieldwork and data collection, we just talk about scientific facts. We don't talk about life experience. And in this talk, it was so amazing. Like, there is this war in Congo, you have to leave, he came back, you have to stay because you have to protect the camp and the monkeys. And I don't know, it was just so amazing. Like, he was so motivated and passionate on this part of his life because it's not just fieldwork, it's a big part of your life. And I don't know, I'm kind of impressed about those kind of people, and it perfectly reflects how I feel now about fieldwork. I want to go because I never done. Because it's something you just want to do, live with monkeys, and just like a big part of your life, a big experience, but also it's so scary and many bad things can happen, but at the end you just want to go back, and we are just passionate.
Okay, so the podcast section that Lucy chose was from our interview with Dr. Tomoaki Nishihara, who's of the Wildlife Conservation Society and has done a lot of work for a number of years in Central Africa for conservation of great apes and other species in the ecosystems there. And it was really nice for us here when we started this student podcast section or selections. We didn't know, which areas of podcasts they would gravitate towards, but this, conservation issues ended up being one of the more important topics that they came up with. Mm-hmm. And so in this section, Dr. Nishihara is going to be talking about his experiences in Central Africa and how he was basically stuck, dealing with the Civil War and, trying to protect the environment, but also his, students that he had involved in projects there for the Wildlife Conservation Society. And it's just really, he's a very impassioned guy. So I hope that comes through in this clip.
When the war started, people said this war is not really big issues. You can stay in Brazil and you can go back to the forest. But actually, the war they started so crazy, and then I was with the WCS people, these American. But it was interesting to see how the French military going to evacuate people. French people is a priority.
Yes.
American, Japanese, later. But luckily, we had the last evacuate airplane to go to Gabon. But unfortunately, at that time, I left my Congolese student in the forest. So I needed to go back to Novalendoki somehow. Mm-hmm. But Japanese embassy people in Gabon said, you can't go there. Mm-hmm. But I refused. Sorry, I have to go back. And then so through Cameroon, I went back to Novalendoki to pick up Congolese student to get him back to his family areas. And then Mike Fay, my previous boss, decided I should stay in the base camp alone. And all other white people, experts and researchers already evacuated. I don't know why Mike Fay told me that, but I said no problem. Because we knew that if nobody there, military people coming to break down base camp and steal all food and fuel and beers and they are going to the forest in the national park to kill animals. So somebody should stay. So actually I stayed there more than 6 months with Congolese responsible. And then sometime military came but they were so kind.
Okay.
As soon as I started speaking local language, they were happy about that. So they forget about chasing me.
Wasn't it frightening though before, just sort of waiting?
No, they are not frightening me. They explained to me, we are here to protect you.
Oh, I see.
So yeah, and then of course they ask money, to pay. So well,
Sure.
we agreed, no problem, we can pay. So actually, some military stayed with us. It was not comfortable, but there was no way.
And so our next student is a second-year master's student named Hikaru Wakamori, and she's in the section of evolutionary morphology.
I study about tails of primates, especially macaques, and I'm interested in the tail length. Many mammals have tails, but primates are a group that has both tailed and no-tailed species. Macaques have a different tail length between species, from very short ones to longer than their body length. I use skeletal specimens to measure and a behavior observation to study about the difference of the length of the tail and features of each species. The reason I got interested in primatology is I like animals. I love to visit zoos and aquariums since I was a little child, and I got interested to wild animals, so I started to think about the wildlife and the environment. Then I realized about the human and animal conflict or habitat damage by human activities. After that, conservation of wildlife became a big topic for me. Primates distribute in rich forests, mainly in tropical area, and those forests also have many species of other animals. So studying primatology is one answer for studying about mammals living in the forest, and it's one step to think more about conservation of wildlife. And that's why I chose Dr. Steve Ross. His talks is about conservation in zoo in US. Zoo is the nearest place for people to know about wildlife, so I was interested what he thinks about the role of the zoo in conservation.
Okay, Hikaru chose a segment from the podcast of Dr. Steve Ross, who is the director of the Lester E. Fisher Center of Great Apes at Lincoln Park Zoo.
Yeah, that was really cool when we had him on the podcast. He was here visiting Japan for some collaborative work, I guess, with people at PRI who often comes to visit. And Steve's really great because he's been doing a lot of work through Lincoln Park Zoo to kind of bridge zoos and basically species living in the wild through kind of awareness and conservation programs,
as well as kind of an on-site cognitive laboratory at the zoo, which is very interesting. And he's also going to have a big role in organizing IPS 2016 in Chicago.
Yeah, that's right. That'll be a really cool conference. Hopefully one at which we'll have a nice booth for the PrimateCast.
That would be nice.
Showcase.
Yeah.
But so Hikaru made some good points about how zoos can be a nice place where people can go and learn about animals and then maybe apply that to their understanding of their conservation status, for example. And so Steve's talking in this clip specifically about, or he begins specifically with problems associated with public perception of conservation status of animals that they typically see in zoos or in advertisements.
That's right. So here's the clip from Steve.
Again, we knew very early on sort of the issues that were at play there. We knew that when people saw chimpanzees on TV that they didn't perceive them the same way that, say, the three of us would perceive chimpanzees. Mm-hmm. But there was no quantifiable evidence of this. So we took on that problem by doing a number of surveys. The last of which that we've published used a experimental design in which we had used sort of Photoshop to alter different photographs of the same chimpanzee to put a human being beside them or to put them in different settings, whether it's a zoo setting or a wild setting or in an office building. And using this sort of paradigm, we were able to sort of tease out what the different effects of different images of chimpanzees were. And we were able to relate very quickly, actually the results were very clear, that simply having a person next to a chimpanzee, standing next to them in free space, not only made people think that chimpanzees might make good pets, but also made them think that they weren't endangered in the wild. And this is something I think a lot of us have sort of suspected, but it was nice to get that empirical evidence of that exact effect. So now when we talk about the use of chimpanzees in entertainment in the United States and elsewhere in the world, there's not only this argument that's based on animal welfare and how those chimps are treated, but also in terms of conservation, that these things are actually have an effect on wild chimpanzees. If you don't think they're in danger, why would you possibly support a conservation organization? I mean, if you look at the way the data reads, that emotional connection is certainly just washed out by this overwhelming feeling. They might like them, but they don't think they're endangered.
Right.
So even though we did ask questions of affect as well, we asked how they felt about chimpanzees, and they were no more likely to think that the chimpanzee in the picture was happy or not.
Right.
So that's unchanged. But when we ask them whether they're endangered or not, oh no, they're perfectly safe. Why? The thing we hear often from the general public is, what if they're endangered, they wouldn't be in commercials. That's a very overwhelming sentiment when you talk to the general public, and that's the sort of thing that we're combating.
Our next student selection continues on with issues surrounding Central Africa. Sayuri Takeshita is a doctoral candidate here at the Kyoto University, and she's also in the section of social systems evolution, and she's going to be introducing herself and talking about what she liked on the podcast.
My general interests include primate endocrinology, social behavior, and conservation biology. And currently, my study uses non-invasive methods of hormone measurement to investigate hormone behavior relationship and the physiological response to environmental change in Japanese macaques. Originally, I became interested in primatology during my undergrad studies in veterinary medicine when I was invited to a project about healthy evaluation of owl monkeys. And by that time, I noticed that despite the richness of primate species in Brazil, there is little information about their biology, and there is an increasing list of endangered species. On the other hand, Japan has a strong influence on primatology, and for this reason, I came to Japan to get my degree, and my plan is to return to Brazil after my PhD to work on conservation of neotropical primates. I chose this podcast of Dr. Janet Nakane interview because I think it was very interesting when she talked about the interchange of knowledge between the researchers and the local people. It shows that this work has an impact not only on conservation but on education, which can be helpful to the development of the local community. And she motivates me to think in other benefits I could extract from my study besides the main goals as a contribution to society.
So the clip that Sayori chose was from our podcast interview with Dr. Janet Nakane, who's a GIS specialist at the University of Maryland.
Yeah, Janet's been here to PRI a couple of times in the last few years to work with Dr. Furichi. They overlap in their field sites in Democratic Republic of the Congo. And her work is really interesting, as Sayori mentioned, and as you'll see in this clip, because she really does try to involve the local communities and the people and thinks that's a necessary way forward in conservation and education. So here's Janet.
The work that we're doing with the African Wildlife Foundation, we're recognized by the DRC government in 2009 as a pilot model for national level land use planning in the country. So they have now recognized the need for land use plans. So the participatory mapping is working with those local communities to secure land management rights.
Oh, okay.
So that they can be formally recognized by the government of the DRC.
It sounds like just from the name of it, though, that you're letting them kind of do the mapping.
We are. It's participatory mapping.
So they kind of collect the data for you, and then you're the one that facilitates it and puts it in the database and does the analysis.
Exactly. We ask them to draw, basically to translate their own local knowledge of their own geography of where they live onto a sheet of paper. Sometimes they begin drawing in the dirt or in the sand, but eventually the map is transferred to a very large format piece of paper. And the map, we guide them through the process because the villagers have never really seen a map or done mapping in the past. So we have to guide them through the process and ask them for prompt them for drawing what they see in how they define their village, the features that define their village geographically. So we ask them, for example, to draw the road that their village is located on, and we ask for the geographic direction of that road, whether it's north, south, east, or west. And then usually we ask them next to place the location of the chief's house on the map, and that sort of helps them to understand the relationship of all of the other features in relationship to the
It sounds kind of like a cognitive experiment.
It is a cognitive
reason
experiment
about spatial relations.
in a lot of ways, yeah. And then we ask them questions about, well, maybe where is your community farm? Where is your cemetery?
Okay.
And from there, and we also ask about locations of major rivers and locations of features that we might be able to see on a satellite image. So those are rivers, maybe hills, any kind of feature, topographical feature. And so then as a team, we transcribe all of that local knowledge that's been conveyed on paper to a satellite image. And we do that in the presence of the villagers. Actually, we have them do it.
Oh, cool.
So first what we have to do is explain what they are seeing in the satellite image and explain the how the satellite image is captured, because they have never really thought about a satellite in the sky taking pictures of the Earth before. And with these satellite images, you see a lot of different colors due to the wave bands. And so we explain what they are seeing in the colors. And often you can see the locations of the agricultural fields. They're very easy to distinguish because the spectral response of the bare ground is very different from the spectral response of the vegetated forest. So we can start seeing the boundaries between the forest and the agricultural areas. And the goal of the mapping is actually for them to start delineating the boundary of where they historically do their agricultural activities, which we cannot understand from just looking at a satellite image. So their local knowledge is really key in actually formulating those boundaries and delineating them. And once those boundaries are delineated, we are working with the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo to formalize those boundaries and to allow those people to now have land management rights of those lands.
So following Sayuri, a second student also chose Dr. Janet Nakuni in her podcast selection. That student is Saiko Torada of the section of Ecology and Conservation.
I am interested in habitat selectivity for endangered animal species and the mechanism to determine that. It is important to understand the habitat requirements of target species and species interaction in the habitat for preventing species extinction and biodiversity loss. Now I am studying about African great apes ranging patterns as a first step. For example, a selection of vegetation type and its seasonal variation associated with food abundance. I worked JICA, which is Japan International Cooperation Agency, before becoming a PhD student, and my goal is to work towards sustainable ecosystems, especially in Africa. Great apes in Africa are very charismatic, but they are also very endangered. They need a huge area and can be a target of illegal hunting. Also, they may maybe have an important ecological role in tropical rainforest. So, it's important to set conservation goals based on good science. That's why I chose a part of the interview of Dr. Janet Nakuni, because I totally agree with the importance of capacity building of local people and her respectful attitude to local knowledge. She is a specialist of GIS analysis and also worked for conservation project for a long time. I want to be a researcher with a specialty that can make a better world by working with people for not only primates but also sustainable ecosystems. Janet is a great example of such a researcher.
So building on the selection by Sayuri, it was really nice that Saigo kind of took it one step further and really talked about the need for capacity building and actually the importance of evidence-based conservation as well. So it was really nice to to hear that. And so here's Janet talking about this topic.
Capacity building has also been a really big part of my work. At the University of Maryland, my research group, we are funded by U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in a program called CARPE, the Central African Regional Program for the Environment. And one of our biggest parts of CARPE, besides forest monitoring and using satellite imagery to analyze forest change in the Congo Basin, is also capacity building for spatial tools and for forest monitoring in the region. And since about 2002, we have been working very closely with a group that's coming out of the University of Kinshasa of younger geography students who are, really wanting to learn GIS and remote sensing and use these tools. And since 2002, we've been sort of providing oversight to their group and creating a laboratory called OSFAC, which is an acronym in French for their group. But they've become now the focal point of GIS and spatial data acquisition, satellite imagery distribution for Central African projects located in the Congo Basin countries.
How important is that imparting the knowledge and having it done locally?
Very important. I can lend my assistance to all of these projects, but I live in the United States and I don't speak the local language. My French is just intermediate level or less. So really, the people who live in the DRC are the ones who really need to be doing this kind of work, and they need the tools in order to solve the problems that are happening in their country.
Okay, so this is, I think, a good point to say thanks to all of our students who brought up these important issues surrounding conservation and choosing the clips based on researchers who have been really involved in conservation efforts around the world. It's definitely something that's in the collective consciousness now of all researchers involved in primatology and other, basically in natural sciences.
And it's been nice to kind of go back and hear a whole range of topics that have been covered by different podcasts.
Yeah.
From anecdotes on the ground, Nishihara's case, to public perceptions of endangered animals in the zoo with Steve, and then some of the more conservation-based participatory approaches in Africa with Janet. So
it's been really fun. And so before we close out here, we should note that the next segment, next podcast, is part 2 of this series, in which we'll be focusing more on the research side of primatology. So about the other half of our students kind of picked podcasts more related to research. So we'll be highlighting some of those clips as well. So just to close this one out, we need to return to the ever-wise words of Dr. Jane Goodall to finish out this podcast.
That's right. And this clip that we'll play is, I think it was definitely my favorite part of her interview, where she kind of sums up her worldview, sort of, and it's very powerful.
And then finally, so we can desperately work to study chimps in the wild. We can fight to conserve them. We can fight to conserve the forests. And yet none of this is going to be the slightest use unless young generations are growing up to be better stewards of this planet. It's not just conservation in Africa and other places where the primates live. It's the whole flipping planet. Mm-hmm. And it's the chimp studies that give me this $1 million question. The $1 million question is, because we're closer to chimps and bonobos than anything else, as a platform to say, okay, but we're different. And what is that difference? And take Ai and Ayumu as prize examples of how intelligent chimpanzees can be in the right situation. Compare that brain with the brain that sent a robot up to Mars that's crawling around taking photos. You can't really compare the two. And so the question is, if we are, and we surely are, the most intellectual being that's ever walked the planet, how come we're destroying our only home? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's because we've lost wisdom. We make major decisions based on how will this affect me now, or the next political campaign, usually the next shareholder meeting. And it used to be decisions based on how will this affect our people generations ahead. And that's forgotten for the bottom line, this materialistic life, this crazy search for money and more money and more money. You know, and it was Gandhi who said the planet can produce enough for human need, but not for human greed. So the chimps led me to this question, to which I have no answer.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cisasp.pri.kyoto-u.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.